The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. I'd like to thank and congratulate Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh for their strength and wisdom and love of our country, which is right now very proud of those justices. When you read the dissenting opinions, there's no way that anyone can argue against them. There's no way. Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long. That I can assure you.
Today, February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell. In a landmark decision, they struck down one of the biggest presidential actions in recent memory. We're talking about an economic policy that affects pretty much every single American, and it's just been declared illegal. But to really get what's going on here, we have to look past the headlines at a legal battle that pits the White House directly against the Constitution itself. So here's the bottom line. The court has ruled 6-3 against the president's massive global tariffs. This was the centerpiece of his economic agenda for the last year. And now it's gone. This is a huge legal defeat for the administration, and we're going to start feeling the effects immediately. So the what is pretty clear, but the how, well, that's where the real story is. This whole thing involves a law that's nearly 50 years old, a declaration of a national emergency, and a really fundamental question about who actually has the power to run the country's economy. All right, let's trace the path of this decision. How did we get from a presidential declaration all the way to a major showdown at the Supreme Court? It all kicked off back in 2025. The president declares a national economic emergency. Now, this wasn't just some speech. It was the specific legal tool he used to impose these sweeping tariffs on almost every country on the planet. As you can imagine, our trading partners hit back almost immediately, and businesses here at home, facing skyrocketing costs, filed a mountain of lawsuits. That whole legal mess worked its way up the chain until the Supreme Court finally said, okay, we'll take the case, setting the stage for today's historic decision. So the crucial thing to understand here is that the way these tariffs were put in place was, well, it was really unusual. It all comes down to this controversial legal maneuver the president used to completely sidestep Congress. And this is the legal tool at the very center of it all, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Now, for decades, presidents have used this for really targeted things, like freezing the assets of a rogue nation. But it had never been used for something this huge, imposing massive global import tariffs. This was a totally new and, as we now know, a very legally risky strategy. And this slide, right here, this is the whole conflict in a nutshell. The Constitution is crystal clear. Congress, not the president, has the power to regulate commerce and set tariffs. But the administration's whole argument was that this IEEPA law gives the president that power during an emergency. The folks challenging it said, no way, that is a dangerous overreach of power. So, how did the Supreme Court make its decision? They used a legal tool called the major questions doctrine. The best way to think about it is like the court telling the executive branch, hey, if you're going to do something enormous that's going to totally reshape the economy, you need a very specific permission slip from Congress. Some vague general law from 1977 just isn't going to cut it. It's the court's way of making sure the government is acting on what Congress actually wrote down, not just guessing at its intentions. And that was pretty much the heart of the majority opinion. You see, the word tariff doesn't actually appear anywhere in that IEEPA law. So the court's logic was simple. Congress never explicitly gave the president the power to do something this big under this specific act. Implying that kind of massive power from some broad language, yeah, that wasn't going to fly. Now for the fallout. The consequences of this ruling were immediate and they are complex, starting with the vote count itself, which was actually pretty surprising. The vote was 6-3, but this was not a simple ideological split. In a really fascinating turn of events, the majority included 3 of the president's very own appointees. That's a huge signal that this decision was based on a specific legal principle about the separation of powers, not just partisan politics. So what exactly is gone? Well, all the tariffs based on that IEEPA emergency declaration, They've been struck down. That includes those sweeping reciprocal tariffs and the big 25% tariffs on Canada, China, and Mexico. But, and this is a really key point, any tariffs that were imposed under different laws, like the steel and aluminum tariffs, those were based on something called Section 232, which deals with national security. They are still in place. This ruling didn't touch those at all. While these tariffs were in effect, the U.S. Treasury collected an absolutely staggering amount of money from American importers. We're talking over $134 billion, which, of course, leads to a very, very complicated question. The court's ruling didn't say anything about what happens to all that cash. So now hundreds of thousands of businesses that paid these tariffs are probably going to sue for refunds. But this is going to be an unbelievably complex legal battle that will take years for the lower courts to sort out. There is absolutely no guarantee that money is coming back anytime soon, if at all. So, with its number one tool for imposing tariffs now off the table, what can the administration actually do? Well, there are a few potential paths forward. Okay, first, they could try to use different laws that weren't challenged here, like that Section 232 national security law we just mentioned. Second, the president could go to Congress and ask them to pass a brand new law that explicitly grants this emergency tariff power. But that would be a very, very tough political fight. And third, this could push the administration back toward more traditional trade negotiations, slower but a lot more legally sound. But this case was never really just about tariffs. Its real, long-term impact is on the balance of power in Washington itself. For decades, we've seen this trend grow where presidents from both parties have increasingly used these kinds of emergency powers to get things done fast and to get around a gridlocked Congress. This ruling is one of the most significant checks on that trend we've seen in modern history. The court has basically drawn a line in the sand and said, there are limits. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is the latest and maybe the most powerful use of that major questions doctrine we talked about. The court has used this exact same principle recently to strike down major EPA climate rules and the administration's student loan forgiveness plan. So a clear pattern is emerging here. This court is actively reining in the power of the executive branch, and that creates a major new hurdle for every future president, no matter what party they're from. So that leaves us with a big question. Does this ruling mean the Supreme Court is correctly restoring the constitutional balance of power between the different branches of government? Or has the court overstepped its own bounds and inserted itself into economic policy where it really doesn't belong? That is the debate this decision has kicked off, and the answer is going to shape American government for many, many years to come.